Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my session on OAuth with Salesforce. Thank you all for joining me. My name is Calvin Norona. I am a technical architect at Blue Wolf. I'm based out of Melbourne in Australia. And today for the agenda, we are going to talk about OAuth from a Salesforce perspective. And OAuth is a very vast topic. It's pretty complex. There are different types of OAuth, and we are going to limit ourselves in this session to talk about two fundamental concepts, and that is to distinguish between authentication and authorization. So the first half of the session we're going to talk about authorization, and that comprises mainly of OAuth 2.0. We're going to talk about some concepts related to OAuth 2.0, and that would lead us into our first demo today. And after that we're going to talk about authentication, and we're going to look at something called OpenID Connect, and that's going to lead us into our second demo. And then we're going to take a brief look at a certification which is related to the concepts that we're going to talk about in the session today. And the main goal of this session will be to understand the fundamentals of OAuth, so that if anyone's interested, they can continue the learning process and continue learning OAuth after this session. So with that, let's try to set the context for our discussion today. So in our everyday roles as Salesforce consultants or Salesforce end users, we often find ourselves staring at this kind of a system landscape where we have Salesforce in the midst of it all, talking to different systems or integrating with different systems, and these systems could be on the cloud such as Workday or Heroku, or they could be systems on the social cloud such as LinkedIn, or there could be systems that are on-premise. These could be SAP or Oracle, and the main problem here is that we have challenges with the integrations themselves, and the other challenge could be there are users who are logging into Salesforce using mobile devices or using laptops. So one of the questions would be, how do we determine the identity of these users as they log into Salesforce and as they propagate their logins into these different systems? And the other question would be, what about the permissions of these users? For example, if there's an administrator who's logging into Salesforce and this administrator is logging into, let's say, Workday, how do we ensure that his permissions or her permissions are taken along with that login? So these are some of the questions that we're trying to answer as part of this session today. So first of all, let's try to distinguish between authentication and authorization. Most of us have come from different parts of the world, different parts of US. We have checked into our hotels. So I thought that would be the best analogy to help explain the differences between these two topics. So authentication is mainly, just imagine when you checked into your hotels at Dreamforce first day, you went to the front desk and you would basically show them your ID, some kind of ID proof, which would be a passport or your driver's license, and you would also show them your credit card. So the driver license or a passport is a means of identifying you. It basically says that you are indeed who you say you are. So that's basically authentication. It is the process of identifying a user based on some set of verifiable credentials. So the authorities who gave you a license or gave you a passport, they are verifiable. And therefore, people know that you are the person who has basically done that reservation. So in a client server setting, this is what happens. The server has to know who the client is, and therefore the server tries to validate the client or verify the credentials of the client. So authentication is, again, it basically is saying you are who you say you are, and in the broader perspective, it comes under the study of identity management. So going back, once you check into your hotel, you basically get your key card, right? So the key card gives you access to your room. It basically gives you access to maybe other facilities like a pool or a gym. If you compare this with someone like a manager or a security officer, he may have access to different parts of the hotel which you may not have access to. So there's a fundamental difference in the permissions given to you. So that's authorization. It's all about permissions. It basically determines what kind of permissions you have once you've been authenticated. And in a client server, sorry, I'm in the wrong slide. Yeah, so basically authorization is all about granting access or denying access to someone based on a set of verifiable credentials. The one fundamental thing to note is authorization is preceded by authentication, and this falls under the broader study of access management. So just to summarize, authentication once again is saying who you are, and authorization is saying what you can do once people have identified who you are. So with that in mind, let's move on to what authorization is, and we'll go on to what OAuth is. So most of us are familiar with certain screens. On the left hand side, Salesforce users, if you're using something like Workbench or maybe even Trailhead, you would see a screen like this saying, give me access to your Salesforce information. So the application is asking you for permission to access your data, and we usually click allow. On the right hand side, if Facebook users are here, we install games or apps on Facebook. One of them is Farmville. When you install it for the first time, it asks you permission, and therefore you allow it. and more often than not, you don't realize the game is actually going to make embarrassing updates on your wall, saying that you grew some carrots or something. But all of this is OAuth happening behind the scenes, and OAuth is powering these kind of permission granting screens. So OAuth, the current version is 2.0, and it's basically an open protocol. That means different folks have gotten together and they have basically put in place these protocols which different systems can use and implement, and it's basically allowing you to securely authorize yourself based on a set of based on a simple and standard format. In other words, what OAuth is that you or me can allow a third-party application or a service to access your data without the need for you to expose your password to that system or to that application. So that's what OAuth is all about. So the question is, why would you need OAuth? The main thing, as I explained now, is security. So in the olden days of the web, before OAuth was in place, for example, if you would go to a website and you want to tweet somewhere, you would basically enter your Twitter username and password into that website or that third-party application. So what this means is you are effectively handing over your username and password and your credentials to that application. What if that gets compromised? What if there's some malicious users there who can take that and basically do whatever they want with your set of credentials? So basically OAuth is taking us away from there, where we can give a subset of these permissions to a different application. Also, as you can see, end users can use OAuth very easily. End users are abstracted from how OAuth works. It's just a button click. You can either allow or deny that service. OAuth also is very secure. We have the concept of SSL, or secure socket layers. This is the transport mechanism or the transport layer of how data is exchanged on the internet, and OAuth works securely with that. And the cool thing about OAuth is that someone can revoke access just as easily as they grant access. That's a pretty cool feature. And finally, for the developers in the room, OAuth is awesome because we don't have to store passwords in our code anymore. And what happens if the password changes or if the code is compromised? So we are moving away from those issues when we use OAuth as part of our programming. So one key thing to understand with OAuth is that there's a concept of the OAuth flow. There are different types of flows. So what an OAuth flow is basically exchange of information. Information is being bounced back and forth different systems. There are different types of OAuth flows, but this is a typical OAuth flow. And there are 4 actors or 4 entities in an OAuth flow typically. These would be the user, which is you or me, who is using an application. And then you have the actual application or the app itself. You have the resource server, which is basically the data or the server. For example, Salesforce, the information stored in Salesforce could be authorization, could be your resource server. And then you have the concept of the authorization server, which is basically doing all the permissions, granting access, denying access. And more often than not, the resource server is the same as the authorization server. For example, Salesforce, it plays both these roles. A good example would be Workbench or your Facebook game. When you start using the game or the application, it's basically going to ask you for access and ask you for permission. And that's going to get propagated into the authorization server. At this point, when you say allow, when you click that button, what's happening is the authorization server is looking at that request. If it likes the request, it's then going to issue something called an access token. So we'll see what access tokens are. For now, think of it as a key that the application then takes and then accesses the resource server on your behalf. And at this point, the application has what it needs. It continues to access the resource server. And at that point, the resource server continues to work with the authorization server to continue working with the authorization mechanism. And you can also revoke this permission at a later stage if required. So this is basically how the typical OAuth flows behave. So we spoke about the access tokens, and the question would be, if you're not using usernames and passwords in OAuth, then what is OAuth all about? How does it work? So the answer is tokens. Tokens are the fundamental building blocks of OAuth, and there are different types of tokens, but there are 3 main types of tokens that we need to try and understand. The main thing is the access token. The whole goal of using OAuth, the end game of OAuth, is to get the access token. Think of it as the session ID. It is the key in which an application can use and access your data on your behalf. You also have the concept of the refresh token. It's a longer lived token, and many OAuth flows, the refresh token is like a first step. You get the refresh token and then you use the refresh token to get the access token. We also have a third type of token called the ID token. Let's hold on to that. We're going to talk about that in the second half of the session. So a quick note about Salesforce and OAuth. It's amazing how Salesforce has kept itself up to date with OAuth. And the support has begun since winter 11, so that's like 6 to 7 years of supporting OAuth. As of today, there are 8 types of OAuth flows. As part of this session, we'll do a deep dive into one of them, which is pretty important. Remaining flows almost work the same, but we'll take a high level look at some of the other flows. And the main reason you use OAuth with Salesforce is for a third-party application or a third-party system to basically access the REST or SOAP APIs in Salesforce. So before we jump into what OAuth is, we need to understand what a connected app is. Many of you guys may have worked with a connected app before. It's just a special type of application that Salesforce has. And in fact, any other system that works with OAuth has the concept of a connected app. So basically, the connected app helps you to implement OAuth. It does authentication. It allows you to do single sign-on. It also allows you to get those access tokens which we learned in the previous slide. So basically, there are quite a few different security mechanisms that you can implement using the connected app. Once you implement the connected app, you get two pieces of information. They are called the client ID and client secret, and we'll learn what they are. And basically, an administrator in Salesforce can further fine-tune or refine the security permissions using the familiar profiles or permission sets to make sure that only people who are needing access can access the connected app from an outside system. So this is how a typical connected app looks in Salesforce. As you can see, I've highlighted some of the important parts. The consumer key and the consumer secret are given to you once you configure the connected app. And we have something called scopes, which we're going to talk about. And we also have the callback URL. Now, as I mentioned, OAuth is all about two systems talking to each other. There's information being bounced back and forth. So when a client application talks to the Salesforce server, the Salesforce server has to know where to talk back. So that's the dial back mechanism where you show the callback URL and implement that over there. Then a quick note about the client ID and the client secret. So these are two pieces of information that are given to you by Salesforce once you configure a connected app. The client ID is more of a public-facing piece of information. It's more of an identifier. It's telling our client application which connected app to speak to. And for example, Salesforce, you have got this long string, and this is a typical format of a client ID. The client secret is more of a secret value. Think of it as a kind of a password. It has to be protected when you're implementing OAuth, and that's why we use this only in one type of flow called the web server flow, and we'll learn why that is the case. We should never include the client secret in a local application because the local application usually is not capable of protecting the client secret. We also looked at what OAuth scopes are. Think of these as further fine-tuning the access to someone's data by a third-party application. So there are different types of scopes in Salesforce, and these scopes work on top of profiles. They work on top of the permission sets that you have already implemented in Salesforce. If you go back to our hotel analogy, if you're a regular hotel user, your key card or your room pass gives you access to your room, maybe to the pool, maybe to the gym. But a manager may have some more access than you, right? So that's like a full access. So the scopes basically differentiate the level of access that someone has. And the other thing to note is that the way OAuth works under the hood, behind the scenes, is that it's all about making HTTP requests to different types of endpoints. So this is an example of the OAuth 2/token endpoint that Salesforce has. So this is where your client application would send a bunch of parameters. For example, some of them are something that we know: client ID, client secret, the redirect URL. So you would basically construct this URL as part of your code when you're implementing OAuth. But the good news is most of us, we don't have access to this because this is kind of abstracted. You have different libraries and different tools that make it so easy, and they do all this on your behalf. And we'll see an example of that in our demo today. And this is a typical response. I'll try to use my pointer. So this is the most important thing, the access token. This is the holy grail of OAuth. That's the whole reason you're doing OAuth for. And this is a sample response of how Salesforce is going to give you this. As you can see, this format is JSON. It's pretty familiar for most people. And there are other parameters being returned, especially what time it's been issued at, what's the encoding signature for this response from OAuth. And this is the list of the different flows. As I said, there are 8 flows. We're going to look in detail at the web server flow because that's the most commonly used flows. And we're going to take a high-level look at the remaining flows as well. So firstly, the web server flow. As the name suggests, a web server flow is used by web server applications. Think of it as LinkedIn. For example, LinkedIn is talking to Salesforce. LinkedIn would incorporate the web server flow. Here, as I said, the web server flows are running on a server. So usually they are less susceptible to be compromised. They provide a higher degree of security. Therefore, you can use your client secret in a web server flow because the server is trying to protect the client secret in the OAuth flow. So the main use case is when you have a web application which is securely running on a server and you want it to talk to Salesforce, that's when you would implement the web server flow to perform OAuth between your third-party application and between Salesforce. So this is how the web server flow works. Just a high level look at it. So you have a client application, the user is using it, so then the user gets redirected into Salesforce. At that point, if the user is not logged in, the user will be asked to log in, the user logs in, and then you get that page which basically asks the user, do you want to allow this or deny this? And if the user allows access to the application, Salesforce sends something called an auth code. That's like a precursor step to actually sending the access token. So the auth code is then taken by the client application, and then it constructs the request to the access token endpoint. And if Salesforce likes that request, if it looks at the parameters, it likes the parameters, it will then grant access and give the access token. At this point, in step number 6, the client application has what it needs, and that is the end game of OAuth, where the client application has the access token, and therefore the client application can now access Salesforce data on your behalf. Here's a quick look at some of the other flows. There's the user agent flow, and this is used when you have a client-side web application or a mobile application. It cannot protect the client secret, so that this flow works slightly in a different way. You also have the username password flow. This is used for autonomous applications where the user is not present to actually explicitly give or deny access. Salesforce usually frowns upon this flow because, as you can see, the name suggests the password of the user is embedded in the flow. So this is used mainly for testing applications. It's not used in real world scenarios as much because the password obviously is being sent back and forth as part of the request. You also have the SAML bearer assertion flow. If you're using SAML for single sign-on, and single sign-on is a concept where you can use one set of credentials to log into different systems. And if you're using SAML there, you can reuse your SAML to actually get an access token for OAuth. Similarly, if you're working on different server-to-server API integrations, and if you're well-versed with something called JWT or JSON Web Tokens, you can reuse a JSON Web Token to actually perform OAuth and get authorized and get an access token to continue working with Salesforce. So this will then take us into our first demo. As part of this demo, what I've done is I've created a simple web page. I've hosted that on Heroku, and the web page is basically going to talk to Salesforce using the web server flow, which we just saw. And basically, we're going to do, once that is successful, we're going to do a simple SOQL query and fetch the top 20 accounts from Salesforce and display it on the web page. This was built using Heroku, and as I said, you don't have to actually work with the nitty-gritty of OAuth. I'm using a library called ForceDK that helps me abstract some of the OAuth mechanisms that's happening behind the scenes. So let's go and look at the demo now. And I showed you this demo was working before, so I hope it works now. So as part of this, there's a button, and this button is basically going to launch my web server flow. This is sitting on Heroku. So this is basically launched my OAuth authorization screen. So it's basically asking me for a bunch of permissions, and I'm going to go and allow it. There's something that happened behind the scenes. It was pretty fast, and now we came back to my web page. There are two different buttons out there. Under the first button, what I've done is I've kind of dissected the whole thing that happened behind the scenes, and I printed it out for you guys. So first thing, what happened was my application constructed the authorization endpoint. It appended a bunch of parameters which tell it to connect to my connected app, which is part of my Salesforce instance. So once that request went in, Salesforce liked it, and Salesforce called my application back using the callback URL, and it appended the code, the authorization code, as we saw. So then my application took that authorization code, and it then constructed the next step, which is the OAuth 2 token endpoint, and then it appended these parameters, including the code, sent it back to Salesforce. Salesforce liked that request, and that's why it sent the request back. I have kind of passed out that JSON response and displayed what is sent back to me by Salesforce. So the main thing, as you can see here, is the access token. This is the whole point of OAuth, and there are some other parameters here, the instance URL, the encoding signature, and what time the response was issued at. Obviously, my laptop is using the Australian time, but anyways. Wrong click. And this is the information just to show that the access token was used. And we can take questions, Q&A after the session, sure. So these are the list of accounts from Salesforce. So let's quickly go back into Salesforce and see my connected app. So this is pretty simple. I've configured it. Once I configure it, I get the consumer key or the client ID, the client secret. I've selected a bunch of scopes which basically give my application full access on my behalf. And there's also the callback URL which is telling it to call my application which is hosted on Heroku. The other cool part about the connected app is that you have a link here which is basically allowing you to view your OAuth usage. As you can see, here's the block button which can allow me to revoke access to any application that is using OAuth. I can also see the usage count, so looks like I've used it pretty 65 times to connect to Salesforce before. And just to show that the app works, we can go to an account. Just do a simple edit, maybe just call it df17. So if I redo the steps that I did before, allow access again, these two buttons. You can see that this socle is basically fetching accounts on the descending order of the last modified date, and it's been modified now. So that's the demo about OAuth, the web server flow. So we'll go back to our presentation. And now let's look at authentication. And the first thing about OAuth is, if there's one thing we learned from this session, OAuth 2.0 is mainly for authorization. It's not designed for authentication or understanding the identity of the user. So that's why we have the concept of OpenID Connect. If some of us have worked on a concept called single sign-on, we are familiar with SAML. So OpenID Connect is an alternative to SAML. Think of it as OAuth 2.0 plus identity. So an identity layer has been built on top of OAuth 2.0 to provide authentication. And Salesforce has amazingly embraced this OpenID Connect. It's a fairly new piece of technology, and you can basically use it to talk to other Salesforce applications and to talk to third-party applications as well using your Salesforce credentials and vice versa. So some of the other providers, obviously, apart from Salesforce, are PayPal, Facebook, AWS, Microsoft. Some of your PayPal applications, when you basically do a payment using PayPal, uses some of the fundamental concepts of OpenID to perform those kinds of transactions. So the question then would be, why can't we use OAuth 2.0 for authentication as well? So the simple answer would be, it's not designed for it. The OAuth 2.0 protocol basically talks about authorization. The end goal of OAuth 2.0 is to get the access token. The access token is representative of the permissions of a user. It's not representative of the identity of the user. So that's where OpenID Connect steps in, and it fills that gap with the identity layer on top of OAuth. So basically, OpenID Connect can also be thought of as a hybrid between the authentication and authorization mechanisms, and it is completely built on top of OAuth 2.0. So this is how the OpenID Connect works. It's kind of similar to how the OAuth flow worked. So first of all, the user, if he requests service from a third-party application, the third-party application then requests the user to authorize it. So when at step number 3, when the user basically authenticates and authorizes the client, the redirection happens with the auth code. We are familiar with that step. Step number 5 is still the same. The application is going to request the token from the user. But now at step 6, you're seeing there's a slight difference now. Along with the access token, we're also getting something called the ID token. And that ID token represents the identity of the user. So now the application knows that we are not only getting the permissions for the user, we're also getting the identity of the user. So the application knows that this is indeed the user who initiated the whole transaction. Obviously, the application can then use that information to get the user profile and understand that this user was who he or she said that they were. So this is a typical response of OpenID. And as you can see, the ID token is a giant string. So any application which is basically incorporating OpenID Connect would then take and try to decode that ID token using the signature. So once that happens, it gets combined into this kind of JSON response. The main thing to note is the odd or the audience parameter, which is returned by Salesforce. It basically is going to correspond to the client ID that initiated the transaction. So now the app knows that this was the client ID that started the whole transaction. So this is how the app can reconcile the identity of the user who initiated the transaction and complete the OpenID Connect transaction. So with this, we'll go on to demo 2. This is a lot more simpler than the first demo. Here I'm going to basically use my Google credentials to log into my Salesforce instance, and we're going to see how that's happening. Most of it is just going to be the configuration of something called an auth provider, and there's not much of code involved in this demo. So let's see how that works. So I'm going to basically log out of Salesforce, and I'm not going to log in using my Salesforce credentials. I'm going to log in using this, which is the auth provider. Looks like a bunch of Google accounts. I'm going to use this one because I had configured this Google account to use this. Hoping it works. Something happened behind the scenes. So as you can see, I used my Google credentials to log into Salesforce. I didn't have to enter my Salesforce credentials. So let me try to basically access Salesforce as an admin. So let me search for auth provider. I see that it's not showing up, and I'll tell you why. Because this user who used the Google credentials doesn't have admin access, and we'll see why that is. So let me log out of Salesforce once again, and let me log back in as my administrator account. And now let me search for auth provider. So this is all I did. I created a new auth provider in Salesforce, and as I said, every application that uses OpenID Connect or OAuth has its own mechanism which is similar to a connected app. So this is the Google version of a connected app which I've created in my Google console, and that gave me its version of the client ID and client secret, which I went and configured in my auth provider settings here. And the only other thing I had to do was the registration handler. This is an Apex class, and the code is usually provided to you by Salesforce, and you can modify the code using the boilerplate code that is given to you. This code is just at a high level doing the following. It's looking and seeing if this user exists in Salesforce. If the user exists in Salesforce, it's going to take that user and attach it to the incoming Google credentials. If the user does not exist or is logging in for the first time, then it's going to create this user and assign the profile that you have configured. So in this case, I had assigned the profile of the standard user, and that is why my user did not have system administrator access to Salesforce. And there are different types of registration handlers. As the name suggests, this is basically taking over once the OpenID protocol has completed, and it can do all the post-processing steps for the users that are logging into Salesforce. And the last thing to look at is the My Domain. The My Domain is a custom domain that you create in Salesforce. It is a prerequisite for creating single sign-on applications with Salesforce. All I've done here is just create a simple domain which distinguishes my Salesforce instance, and I've gone here and said that in the login page also go and add my auth provider. So this takes less than 20 minutes to set up. You can see how easy it is. You can go ahead and set up OpenID Connect and log in using different credentials like Google or Facebook to log into Salesforce. So with that, we'll get back into our presentation. The last thing I wanted to talk to you guys was the Identity and Access Management Designer certification. So if you're interested in some of the architect certifications like System Architect or the CTA, which is the Certified Technical Architect, then you will have to take this exam. The main things that the exam covers is mainly concepts around authentication and authorization and single sign-on with respect to Salesforce. It's very important to understand the different identity features of Salesforce. We saw some of them in this presentation. We saw connected apps, auth providers, My Domain. You need to know a more detailed understanding of these kind of concepts. You also need to know the different types of OAuth flows. We saw one of these flows today. The main thing to understand is what are the differences between these different OAuth flows and when to use each one. What are the use cases for these flows? And lastly, there are a bunch of security features which we could not look into a lot. There are things like two-factor authentication, high assurance sessions, IP restrictions, login hour restrictions. So you need to know and understand these things for this certification. Most folks think that it's hard, but the main thing is to understand these concepts. And I had written a blog post which was deemed useful by a bunch of folks, so I've added the link there in case anyone needs to look at that. And lastly, I also put a bunch of links which I thought are useful, so I'll leave it for a few moments. One of the cool things here is a tutorial for integrating Salesforce and LinkedIn using OAuth. It's pretty easy actually, it's a step-by-step tutorial. If you're a Fitbit fan like me, you can access Fitbit APIs and impress your friends, display that information on Salesforce. You can read more about the OAuth 2.0 protocol. These links helped me a lot to learn this. And last but not the least, Trailhead is amazing. A lot of amazing trails out there which help you understand more about OAuth, single sign-on, identity access management features with Salesforce. So definitely log into Trailhead and look at those things. For a few more seconds. Okay. And with that, we end this, and I'm open for questions if there are any. Please, if you can please come up here and. Thank you, guys.
For OAuth, don't I have to have already created the connected app in Salesforce before I try to attempt to log in?
Yes, that is
authorize?
correct. Yes.
And the same thing is true with OpenID Connect. I have to have already created the authorization provider in Salesforce. It has to be there.
Correct.
I can't kind of connect on the fly.
Yes,
that's
correct? Exactly correct. Yes. So the connected app is kind of a prerequisite for doing OAuth with Salesforce, as you correctly mentioned, and the same goes with the auth provider as well for OpenID Connect.
Okay. And then another question, you said that OAuth does not do authentication, it only does authorization.
Yes.
So who's doing the authentication?
So that's a bit of a contentious question sometimes, but as the protocol dictates, OAuth is all about authorization. That means granting permissions, taking away permissions. So the OpenID Connect part which we saw, that does the actual authentication. So the authentication again is about the identity of a user, and therefore you would need to use something like SAML or OpenID Connect to perform authentication on top of OAuth.
So SAML is doing the authentication.
Yes.
And OAuth is doing the
authorization.
Yes. Okay. I have a few more, but I'll take them after.
Sure.
Thank you.
Any other questions, guys?
You showed the demo where you were able to log into Salesforce using your Google credentials.
Yes.
How does Salesforce identify whether a user already exists or it needs to create a new user? Is it based on email address, or how does that?
So I think it's based on the email address. So the registration handler which we saw basically has the code. So that's what happens. In Apex, basically what's happening is it does a SOQL query into the user and contact objects and sees if that user exists. And if it exists, it tries to use that user to log in and associate that user with the credentials that you use. For example, your Google credentials or Facebook credentials. If that user does not exist, it actually creates the user on the fly. And this is called user provisioning. But basically this is happening in your registration handler that is usually done in Apex code.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
So if you're not doing a server-side app, but like a client-side app where you can't hide the secret, which flow do you recommend?
Yeah, so for that we would basically use the user agent flow, because most often the scenario which you mentioned, the app is now sitting on a mobile device or a browser. Mm-hmm. So you would use the user agent flow in that case, because the user agent flow is not using the client secret, it uses a totally different mechanism to incorporate OAuth.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you guys, thank you so much, and please do connect with me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for attending my session. Thanks guys.